Hi, everybody. In this video, I'm going to introduce the concept of interactions and run through a quick example of why we use interaction terms in our regression models and what type of question it helps us answer. I'm not going to address the technical details of how to actually run the interaction, and that's something that you can read about here in this chapter instead. So what we'll do first is we'll review something we already know, an example with no interaction. And to do that, we'll go down to this plot that we have, and I'll just introduce an example here. So let's imagine that we have some outcome of interest. So we've measured 20 or 30 people on that outcome and plotted that on this scatter plot. We also have a measure of everybody's age. And we're interested in the relationship between that outcome and everybody's age. And remember, this outcome can be something simple like these people's score on a test or how proficient they are at their job. It doesn't matter for this example what exactly it is. Now, the other thing to note is that all of the people that we've plotted here in this data set, they're either female or male. So we also know what gender group they belong to, and that's going to be very important to our example, and we can label that to make it more clear. And now you can see that the points in the scatter plot, which are dark blue, correspond to females in our data set. I just circled an example. And the light blue dotted line, or just the light blue points, correspond to males in our data, and I just circled an example of that. And now I've put two questions on the screen. And the two questions are that we want to know the relationship between outcome and age separately, that's the key, separately for females and for males. And we want to use our data set to do that. So what we've learned so far in this class is we've learned how to make a regression model that includes the outcome of interest as the dependent variable. We can include age as a continuous numeric independent variable. And we can add female as a dummy variable that has converted a qualitative concept into numbers that the computer can interpret. And in this case, female identifies females as with the number 1 and males with the number 0. So that's what we have so far. What such a regression model allowed us to do previously is it allowed us to make a plot like this. And what we see here, we have two lines, and both of those lines have a slope of 0.59. So what we can learn from this is that for females, as their age increases by 1 year, their outcome increases by 0.59. And the same is the case for males. As males increase by 1 year in age, their outcome increases by 0.59. The other thing we can learn from this regression model that we've plotted here is that there's a slight difference between males and females in their outcome at every single level of age. So let's see what we mean by that. Let's look at age 5. At age 5, females score this much down here, and males score this much up here. Let's look at age 7.5. Males score this much up here, females score this much down here. This gap between the two lines is the same at every single age. If you were to look at age 5, we see here that the outcome for someone who's age 5 is 5.0 for a male and just less than that for a female. This difference is going to be equal to the difference we found between males and females in the regression model that we see in the table showing the regression results. And that's a difference of 0.23. Females are lower by 0.23 on this particular outcome. But keep in mind that the question of interest that we have has less to do with the difference between males and females among themselves. Our question is about the relationship between outcome and age for females, and that same relationship for males. And that answer, according to this, is just the number 0.59. It's the same answer for females as for males. But now we could ask ourselves, isn't it a little bit suspicious that as females would increase 1 year in age, females would increase by 0.59 in their outcome, and the same thing for males, as males increase by 1 year in age, they also increase by 0.59 in their outcome? That's a little suspicious. Maybe we think that the slopes of these two lines showing these two relationships should actually be different slopes. But the way that we created this regression model previously, and I'll scroll up to show how we did that, just so it's in this video. This is the kind of regression model we made with age and female as separate independent variables. And this is the code we used to create it. This regression model did not allow the computer to draw different slopes for males and females in our data regarding the relationship between outcome and age. Everything we're trying to figure out is about that relationship between outcome and age. You need to always keep that in mind. We're just looking at that relationship separately for our two gender groups in our data. So now we turn to the question of, well, how can we program the regression model so that we can get separate slopes for females and males just using the data that we have here? So now I have scrolled down to the next section where we're going to talk about how to add what we call an interaction term to the regression model. And so you can read about the details here, but what we end up doing is we end up running this code right here, and we get a result table like this that includes age, just like before, female, just like before, as independent variables. And of course, this is the same female dummy variable, 0 for males, 1 for females. And then we have a third independent variable, which is the multiplication of the age variable and the female variable. And I encourage you to look carefully at the data set that's presented in this chapter to see exactly what we mean by that, by the multiplication of those two. And then we get a result like this. So we are still asking the very same research question that we were before, but now we have given the computer the ability to answer the research question a little bit more specifically for females and males separately. So I'll remind you once again, the main thing, the only thing that we're interested in is the relationship between outcome and age. But we want to know what is that relationship between outcome and age separately for females and for males. And now that we've made an interaction term, we can see that the computer drew two regression lines for us, which have different slopes. We have this line, which is much steeper, and that one is the relationship between outcome and age for the females. And this less steep line is the relationship still between outcome and age for the males. Now we've added the slopes of the two lines, and let's interpret what each slope means. So let's start with the females. And what we see here is that for every 1 unit increase in age, that means for every 1 year increase in age of a female in our data set, females are predicted to increase in their outcome by 0.96 units of that outcome. And for males, we'll use the same approach to interpreting. As males increase in age by 1 year, males in our data are predicted to increase on average by 0.22 units of our outcome. So even though this is the very same data set that we talked about at the start of this video, and it's the very same research question, we now have a different answer, which is that the relationship, which is represented by these slopes, is different for males and females, but it's the relationship between two other variables that are not related to gender. Those variables are outcome and age. It's just that this relationship between outcome and age is a different relationship for females and for males. And that's what we got the regression model to do for us. And I'll just scroll up and preview what the regression table looks like. Here we are. And the way that I got those two slopes, and you can read about this in the chapter, but I'll just quickly go through it. The way that I got those two slopes for males and females is that males are the reference group. So for males, the slope is 0.22. And again, that's the slope of the relationship between age and the outcome. Just for males is 0.22. Females are coded as 1 in the variable called female. So for that, we look at this 0.74 and we add it to the 0.22 to get a slope of 0.96. So for now, I encourage you to actually write out the regression equation and then rewrite it separately for females and for males to understand how we get these different slopes for females and males for the relationship between age and outcome. But in the future, if you see a regression table that someone else has made, for example, which includes an interaction term, you can just quickly do the addition that I just went through of the 0.22 plus 0.74 for females, or just knowing that you can just look at the 0.22 for the males, because they're the reference group. They were coded as 0. I'll say it yet another time. The most important thing you can remember here is that the research question is about the relationship or association between outcome and age. The research question is not related to people's gender. It just so happens that we want to answer that research question, which is not related to gender. We want to answer that research question separately for females and males, and this interaction term allows us to do that. Speaking more generically, the interaction term allowed us to take our Y variable, our outcome of interest, and a continuous numeric X variable, and look at the relationship between those two numeric variables, which in this case was outcome and age. We looked at the relationship between those two numeric variables separately for members of a third grouping variable, which in this case was the variable called female, which identified everybody's gender. Now, I'll add one final thing before we stop the video here, which is that you may have also noticed that the intercepts for the two regression lines are now very different than each other. And what I'd like you to do for now is to just ignore the intercepts and focus on the slopes, because the slope tells us the relationship between the two variables that we're interested in. The intercepts are just a specific case, right? The intercepts are telling us that when someone is age 0, their outcome is predicted to be this much for females and this much for males. But somebody's outcome, let's say it's their test score or some other measure that we might be interested in, it's not very meaningful when someone is age 0. So in this and many other cases, we can just ignore the intercepts and just focus on the fact that these slopes of these lines are different for females and for males, and that these lines tell us about the relationship between outcome and age. So for every 1 unit increase in age, what happens to the outcome? Well, it turns out it increases, but it increases more for females than for males. That's what adding an interaction term to our regression model allowed us to figure out. So I'll stop there presenting about interactions. Please do read through the technical details because I did not cover everything in this video. And I really encourage you also to ask any questions you might have about this because it can be a bit complicated, but at the same time, it's a really powerful and important technique that allows us to look deeper within our data and more precisely answer the questions that we're interested in. Thanks for listening to this, and I'll see you all again soon, I'm sure.